Hello, good evening. I'm Lida Dubin, Executive Director at the Center for Fiction. How many of you all are joining us here tonight for the first time? Love to see a little show of hands. Fabulous, good, welcome. So the Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit organization that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, our first novel prize, and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. So please follow us on social and sign up for our mailing list so that you don't miss future amazing events like tonight's. For example, on October the 24th, come see Jesmyn Ward and Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're presenting that at Town Hall. Get your tickets now. Information's on our site. So a few housekeeping announcements. Our cafe and bar will be serving until 8:30. We will have an audience Q&A. So when it's time for questions, raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you so that all the guests on the live stream can hear your question. If you're watching the live stream and you have a question, type it into the chat at any time. And lastly, before I welcome our guests to the stage, I want to say a special thank you to our programming partners at the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival. We do many things with them over the course of the year, and it's a wonderful partnership, so thank you all very much. All right, now for our guests. Safiya Sinclair was born and raised in Montego Bay, Jamaica. She is the author of the poetry collection Cannibal, winner of the Whiting Writers Award, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Metcalf Award in Literature, and the Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Poetry. Cannibal was selected as one of the American Library Association's notable books of the year, was a finalist for the Penn Center USA Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Penn Open Book Award and the Dylan Thomas Prize. Welcome, Safiya. Interviewing her will be Tara Westover. Tara is an American historian and memoirist. Her first book, Educated, debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and remained on that list in hardcover for more than 2 years. The book, a memoir of her upbringing in Idaho, was a finalist for a number of national awards, including the LA Times Book Prize, the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and the National Book Critics Circle Award. To date, it has been translated into more than 45 languages. For her impact, Time magazine named Westover one of the 100 most influential people of 2019. And in 2023, she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Biden. Please welcome Tara to the stage. Thank you. Wonderful. Good. Have a great conversation. See you on the other side.
Welcome, everybody. The mic's working. Everybody can hear us. No. Oh, she's gone. You done? You good? You got me muted? I got shot. Perfect. Well, there's a question that I always get asked at my book events that I hate. Well, because I think how many people had the opportunity to start the book? We won't say finish. Considering publication day, that's quite good. So a lot of people aren't going to have been able to yet. So you do have to do this kind of obligatory, you had a unusual upbringing. Tell us about your unusual upbringing. Mm-hmm. And I think, you can't hear. You got a microphone. Oh, can you hear me?
Is that better? Is that improving the situation?
Mine is a little bit harder to reach.
Bear with us. All right, that should help. All right, we good? Okay, so you had an unusual upbringing.
Yeah.
Unusual for people in this room. you didn't grow up in Brooklyn, you grew up in Jamaica, but unusual for someone who grew up in Jamaica. So why don't you tell us about it? My least favorite question.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in this very strict Rastafari household in Jamaica.
So you have to look, your mic's here, so you have to look at me.
I have to look at you. Okay.
You guys can hear her, right? Yes. I don't know why, I'm anxious about the sound now. I'm going to calm myself down.
Yeah, I grew up in this very strict Rastafari household in Jamaica, with a very militant Rasta father who, is a reggae musician, but he was very devoted to Rastafari, which I think most people don't know what Rastafari is about or what the tenets of Rastafari are about. And, a lot of the rules of Rastafari are quite repressive for women. And so my sisters, my mother and I, we had to sort of cover our arms, cover our knees. A lot of women covered their hair. All Rastas had to wear their hair in dreadlocks, which was a sacred marker of your devotion to Rastafari. They also believed in the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie as the godhead figure of Rastafari. And I think also when most people think about Jamaica, they think that Rastafari is the thing that defines Jamaica, but Rastas are actually historically a persecuted minority in Jamaica. So, they historically, since the beginning of the movement in the 1930s, have been pushed to the fringes, kicked out of their families, turned away from their homes, forbidden from walking along the beach sides that were being developed for tourists. And in the 60s, we even had a prime minister that gave the army a directive that said, "Bring me all Rastas, dead or alive." And this led to an awful weekend of terror in Jamaica where most Rastas were pulled from their homes, tortured, jailed, forcibly shaved. Their beards and dreadlocks were cut, an unknown number killed. And so that persecution and that isolation of the Rastafari trickled down to me and my siblings, who we were among the first Rasta children to integrate public school in Jamaica. And so wherever we went, we were the only Rasta children, because the Rastafari are 1% or less of the Jamaican population.
In your book, you tell a story about when I think it's pretty illustrative of the way that being a part of this community that separated you from the rest of the world, and you're kind of both trying to honor that, but also trying to integrate and make friends and have a life.
Yeah.
Like people want to have.
Yes.
And you have a story about a friend, I think, that you met at school, your first friend. Will you tell us about that?
Yeah, so, part of my father's rules was to keep us away from what he called Babylon, and what the Rastas call Babylon is sort of the idea of anything that's a part of the Western world, anything that's born from the evil ideology of the Western world, of racism, capitalism, Christianity. He called it Babylon. So
what would he have thought of your boots?
He would probably say they irie, man, they irie. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Good. It's great.
Oh, he would have liked the boots. I like the boots.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were having a serious thought. And
what was I? Oh, so the world outside the gate, he thought of as Babylon. So he would always tell me and my siblings to stay away from Babylon. Don't keep friends. Don't have friend and company. So we weren't really allowed to have friends. But when I went to school, like any normal 9-year-old or 10-year-old, I wanted to have friends. And so I befriended this girl in primary school. And she sent someone with a note to me that said, "I don't want to be your friend. I don't want to be friends with a Rasta." And that was kind of the first moment where I felt this deep hurt, this deep wound that was tied to being from a Rastafari family. And my selfhood withered in that moment.
What do you think her ideas were of what it meant to be a Rasta? Like, what do you think she thought? Why was she afraid of you, I guess, is the question. Like, why would that be?
I don't know. But I think most people in Jamaica themselves, Jamaica is a deeply Christian country. So, you know, a lot of people have this idea born from these old colonial roots of the Rastafari being pariahs. They have this idea. We even had a folk tale in Jamaica about the Rastafari, the Rasta man being called the Black Heart Man, which is supposed to be this monstrous killer that snatched children in the night. And so people really believed this. There were some people in the older generation in Jamaica who believed in this idea of the Black Heart Man, this like the Rasta man as this like monstrous, like savage killer who, you know, would do violent things. And so I think she probably, or her parents, maybe clung to some of these ideas, you know, because we would go to school and people would ask us how come we could read. People thought that because we were Rastas, that we weren't able to. I see mommy nodding like, yes, it's true. You know, people would ask us like, how come you're wearing shoes, or how come you can read? Because they had this idea of the Rastafaris being uncultured, uneducated, savage.
Yeah, it's very interesting how little you can actually tell about a person from the way they look. You know, we met at a writing. I'll tell them where we met.
Yeah.
We met at a writing fellowship in Umbria, in Italy, actually. You know, very fancy people. And anyway, we met there, and I didn't know anything about you, obviously, but you know, you very let's just say you present well. And then when I read your book, there was a lot of it I sort of identified with and recognized, and it was a little bit confusing for me to have met this incredibly well put together, poised, you know, and I don't know. It's interesting to think about what that little girl, she sees you with your hair the way it is and the clothes you're wearing, and she sees only this religion that she doesn't understand. And then there's a way where, we can change our appearance also, and that can hide things about us. You know, like I would never have guessed anything about your background when I met you. Nothing at all. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
What can you really tell about a person?
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't really judge a person from how they present.
Good. That's why I dress the way I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just wanted your approval. That's all.
Yes.
Tell me about your prologue. You start your prologue in a specific moment, and tell us about that and why you picked the very first scene. I think is always a very interesting moment.
Yeah.
When someone chooses, this is where I'm beginning my story, and why did you?
Yes. So the prologue begins with me at 19 years old, pretty much on the precipice of my existence, where I'm having to make this very big decision between belonging, remaining in this culture, you know, remaining with the roots of Rastafari, or going toward my own becoming as a young woman and choosing for myself the kind of future I wanted and the kind of woman that I wanted to be for myself versus what my father wanted me to be. And so the book kind of starts there, it begins there, where I'm thinking about this, and I remember having this horrific vision of my future self, and I began to think, okay, if I continue going along this path that my father wants me to go on, right? Who would I be in the future? Who would I become? What would my life be like? And I just imagine that, you know, I would be this silent, pliant, obedient Rasta woman who is, you know, her only connection to the world is through her husband, who is a Rasta brethren. You know, she would bear many children and remain in the kitchen, but she would have no access to expressing her own hopes and dreams, her wants, her desires. She would have no way to express her art, and she wouldn't be herself. And I realized I had to cut that future down immediately. I had to cut that woman away from me and choose for myself the future that I was going to make and the woman I was going to be. And so it, you know, I was like, okay, this is a good place to start.
You had a little section, I think, that you were going to read to us that was, I think, thematically related to this moment.
Yes. Should have pulled it up before.
I could have given you warning.
That's good. It's good. So the first time I began to think about the future and who I would become was around the moment where I was 9 years old. I began to grow tall, and I think somehow I felt like I was sinning because I began to grow tall, and I was, moving into, adolescence. And I remember my father said, "You cannot climb trees anymore." My siblings and I were wild children. We would run around the bush, climb the trees, we'd be up and down. But I remember there was this one day, 9 years old, my father said, "You cannot climb trees anymore. You cannot wear pants anymore." And he told my mom, "Just throw all the pants, all the shorts out." He said, "None of my girls will wear this again. They'll be Jezebels if they do." But then my brother was still climbing the trees. There were no restrictions placed on him, and I began to question that. And so this short passage I'm going to read blooms from that moment where I first begin to question who I'm going to be and what I think about that. I came to realize that what my father wanted on his return from Japan was the perfect daughter. And when a Rasta man said daughter, he meant both his wife and his child, as my father called my mother his daughter when speaking to his Rasta brethren, who also called their partners their daughters. For the men of Rastafari, the perfect daughter was everything a woman was supposed to be. The perfect daughter was whittled from Jah's mighty oak, cultivating her holy silence. She spoke only when spoken to. The perfect daughter was humble and had no care for vanity. She had no needs, yet nursed the needs of others. Breastfeeding an army of Jah's mighty warriors. The perfect daughter sat under the apple shade and waited to be called, her mind empty and emptying. She followed no God but her father until he was replaced with her husband. The perfect daughter was nothing but a vessel for the man's seed, unblemished clay waiting for Jah's fingerprint. "You're old enough now to help out in the kitchen," my father told me, making quick work of whittling me. "The I need to learn from your mother. Watch how she carries herself." I watched my mother and found in her long silences something potent waiting to be said, like the anxious moment before thunder. But no matter how much I longed for it, she never thundered. She never spoke her mind or disagreed with my father. She smoked and breastfed Shari. She smoked and spared me from the tedium of kitchen work. She smoked and woke up before dawn to cook all our meals. She smoked and woke up before dawn to cook all our meals and hand wash our clothes, folding them away afterward like her thoughts in the back of the chest of drawers untouched. She was the perfect daughter. Perhaps it was true what my father said, that I lacked discipline, the way any 9-year-old lacks discipline. I didn't always listen. I was skeptical. I doubted his gospel. I was curious. I touched the flame simply because it was burning. Because discipline always seemed to me the pin that held the butterfly in its display case. Work maketh the man. Day after day, I swung over those words and saw ahead of me a life withering slowly under his multiplying decrees. Day after day, my heart bucked up against it. I was never going to be the perfect daughter. A grin of mischief opened ever so slyly inside of me, a seedling of a voice that said, no. And I just want to clarify that my mother is no longer silent at all, okay?
So that passage kind of describes, I think, this moment where you see this path. It's making this sound very mystical. Thanks for the soundtrack. You have a decision to make, right? And there's your father's way of looking at the world, and that would imply a certain version of you that would have to come into being, remain in being, and you end up not doing that.
Yes.
Spoiler.
Spoiler alert.
How do you source that difference? Like, how do you look back and think this was the beginning of when I started to trade out his worldview and I started to develop my own? Because it's very natural. Children, your family makes your world for you. You know, people actually at my events, I get asked this really weird question a lot, where people ask me if I think my family was a cult. And I like to say that I think every family
is a cult. Yes.
Is a cult. Because, you know, your family makes your world for you, and whatever is normal, I mean, human beings can be habituated to just about anything, and whatever your childhood world is the world as far as you know.
Yeah.
And how do you begin to say, to say no, like, I want something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think I questioned it primarily, as I was saying, because I began to see the differences as my brother and I were very close in age. We're 2 years apart. So for a long time, we were like two peas in a pod. And then I remember that there was a moment in our lives around when I turned 10 years old that it was very apparent to me that our paths were diverging. And that what he was being tasked to be was so different than me. Simply because of these views that the Rastafari had of women. You know, a lot of Rastafari brethren believe that women are more susceptible to moral corruption because they menstruate, and they call them unclean and impure, you know, and so things like these obsessed my days for a long time. I was fearful of menstruating for the first time. I never wanted to be unclean. I was obsessed with this idea of purity in a way that I don't think ever crossed my brother's mind. And I remember around this time I went to a gathering of Rasta people in Montego Bay, and I watched as all the women were in the kitchen. They were making all the food. They were bringing the food to the men. They were tending to the children. They didn't have a moment to themselves. They never sat down. And the men were outside in a drumming circle, talking amongst themselves, what Rasta brethren call reasoning. And ever so often, they would call the young boys in and give them some wisdom and reason with them. And I remember the jealousy that pierced me. I was like, I want to be called into the circle and have this wisdom passed down to me. And, you know, I was not ever invited. And so those were some of the key moments where I began to say, no, I don't think.
That's not for me.
It's not for me. Yeah.
And you write a lot about poetry, kind of the way that poetry drew you out and, I don't know, saved you maybe. So I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think because I spent so much time being told to cultivate this silence, right? That a woman's silence was her greatest virtue. I spent a lot of time growing up and in my house bent under the silence and not ever feeling that I could cultivate or nurture myself. And it was poetry that was the first thing that made me feel like there on the page, I could make a home for myself, I could nurture a voice. And when everybody went to sleep, I could think about what I wanted to say, I could speak, and I could think about who I wanted to become. So poetry very much empowered me and gave me a voice. And for me, it was always a space of survival. And I have to credit that to my mother, who is here tonight, because she handed me my first book of poems after that friend that you talked about that said, I don't want to be your friend because you're a Rasta. And I felt this deep sense of hurt, and I harmed myself. And to, I think, alleviate that harm that I was feeling. My mother handed me a book of poems, and she told me that poetry was always the thing that made her world feel more expansive, that poetry always soothed the hurt of the world for her, and she thought that it might help me as well. And what she handed to me that day was gold. So thank you, Mommy.
You had a poetry mentor that you wrote about, who, from what I could tell as a part of the story, made a big difference in terms of opportunity for you and helping you learn and trust yourself, but in other ways was
Not
disappointing.
so much, yes.
Yeah, and I wondered if, I think we've all had, or probably many of us have had, moments where we've had heroes that have actually helped us a lot. Like, they made a big difference. And our lives would have been worse without them. But then you realize, actually, there's something wrong. And, losing one of your heroes is a very difficult experience.
Yeah. It was this very strange thing, because, as you say, there was so much that I got out of it. He was the first person when I sent my poems in. I was 16 years old, and he called me on the phone and was like, I think you have talent, like, we need to work together immediately. And that was the first time I felt validated in that anything I had to say was worth hearing, So he made me feel, after, years of being told silence is what is my virtue. He was like, no, I want to hear what you have to say. And so that was a comfort for me, and that was a great boost to my young poet self. And so I studied with him, and I learned all the foundations of poetry with him. But then it, as you mentioned, and is this a spoiler? I don't know. It turned out to be not so great. That all, I just began to think, are all men fallible? Are all men, I, in many ways, had supplanted my father's voice in my mind with his voice.
Naturally.
And then I realized that too was wrong. That he failed me also.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing about who we put in that role.
Yeah.
And it is incredibly painful when someone in that role turns out not to deserve it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he told me many times he hates being written about.
Good. Well,
And I was like, well, what can you do now?
I wanted to talk a little bit about money. Just to stress you out. No, because I remember in your story, there's a period where you get this opportunity to go to college, like a good university, and you could go and your life could change, and you wait a long time. I don't remember how long, but more than a year.
3 years,
like years. And the reason is money.
Yeah,
There's just
my
no money.
parents couldn't afford it,
And I just thought, I also lived a life for a lot of years was very much dictated by dollars and cents, and and especially my education. And I just would interested to hear what you think about the role of money in education, and money as an obstacle, and the role of money in learning and all that.
I mean, I think in a perfect world,
We're building tonight. Finish by tomorrow.
This idea of money or having it or not having it should never prevent somebody from having a good education. But that's not the world that we live in. So that's unfortunate, and, particularly in Jamaica, we kind of have this sense, many people in Jamaica who do live on the poverty line, that the only way to lift yourself and your family out of this cycle of not having money is either through education or through, I guess, being Usain Bolt, like just hoping you're from Trelawney and you can run fast. But a lot of people do see education, just say, go study your book so you can, make a better life for yourself, in the hope that you get a scholarship, because so many people in my family. I mean, I was the first girl in my family to go to college and graduate from college. And my mother herself, when she was 16, 17, had a scholarship. I mean, she had an acceptance to college in Scotland to study chemistry. And her family had no money, and she never was able to go. And that really, when I think about that, it wounds me all the time, because I often wonder, I mean, you know, what your path would have been if you could have gone to study chemistry in Scotland. But, I mean, I'm happy I'm here. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the whole project of writing a memoir and why one does that peculiar thing.
I want to ask you.
I don't know the answer. I get asked a lot. This is like very therapeutic for me to sit here and ask you all the things people ask me. It's like incredible. I love it. Can we do it tomorrow? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, what is memoir? Why write one?
You know, I joke and say, so no white people will come up to me again and ask me stupid questions about Jamaica.
That is not going to work. That just sounded a giant alarm that says, come talk to me if you have questions about Jamaica.
No, read the book if you have questions about Jamaica.
Yeah, that's not what's going to happen. But I love that you think that they're just going to be like, I'll just read the whole book. I won't ask my question.
I mean, I'm being
nice try.
But it's like, no, but you know, the first time I started thinking about writing a memoir was when I came to the US to study. And that was one of the things where I was kind of stunned with how little foreigners knew about Jamaica and about Jamaican history and Jamaican culture, and you know, how Rastafari culture is interwoven with Jamaican history. You know, the fact that most people do think that, people have asked me, am I related to Bob Marley? You know?
Solid question. Solid question.
So, like, wow, people really think this.
I have people, you know, I grew up Mormon, and I have people come up to me and they're like, oh, do you think you could get a message to Mitt Romney? And I'm like, no. Like, why would you?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, and people do have this strange tendency to be like, I heard of that once, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
So I think part of it is dispelling some of these stereotypes about Jamaica. It's sort of re-narrativizing and broadening the global imagination about Jamaicans, about real Jamaicans, outside of the postcard idea of paradise.
Are you telling me the truth? This was about like educating people about Jamaica?
Part of it was.
How much of it? Because I have to say, I wrote my book, and I was like very nice to let people know about rural Idaho, but I don't know how much of me was like, people really need to know about rural Idaho. I think I should write this to inform them. I had other things on my mind.
Yeah.
I'm interested. What were those
But
things
I think
for
growing
you?
up Rastafari is this very unique thing in that so many people in the world know what that is and have this idea of what it is, but the ideas they have about it are wrong. And so that was part of why I wanted to write it. And also when people think of Rastafari, they think of the men. They probably think of one particular man, but they don't.
Who you're related to.
Right. But they don't think about the women. Or does anyone ever even know what a Rasta woman's dreams are like? What her life is like? What a young Rasta girl growing up in this culture is like? No. And that was my life. And so I thought there was something there to be said and to be shared, but also about how literature and how we were talking about education can make a path for someone to sort of change the course of.
You can't have my title. I'm keeping my title. You have
But I know you like my title
You have a
too,
great
yes.
title. It's a very good title. I mean, these are really good reasons, and I'm also interested in, like, personally, was it really helpful for you to kind of put the story in order and make sense of it? Before my book was published, I had a conversation with this amazing memoirist named Kathy Rensenbrink, who published a really beautiful book called The Last Act of Love. And I was on the phone with her, and I said, you know, writing a memoir is, I did this, it's going to be therapeutic, it's going to help me. And she was like, yeah, writing a memoir is super therapeutic. She said, publishing it isn't.
Yeah.
And I did find that to be vaguely true. Like there was like it was all therapeutic in the end, but there's a different thing that happens when you're kind of writing and putting things in order for yourself versus when you go on a stage and start telling people about your life. Like it's a very different and slightly bizarre activity, I would say.
Very bizarre. Yeah.
As someone who does it a lot.
Yeah. And I'm kind of realizing that now because I'm
good timing.
Good timing, yeah, because in the last month, 2 months, I've been asked a lot of the same questions,
that'll happen
100 times. I'm like, okay, I'm glad that I have a lot of distance or some distance between the things that happen in the book, because if I didn't, some of those questions would have been very hard to answer over and over and over,
You're on the first day.
Yeah.
You're going to be doing this longer.
Yeah.
You're just starting.
Yeah. My challenge is trying to answer in a different way each time, or just accepting I'm going to answer in the same way each time.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
This is a very niche conversation we're having now. I don't know if anybody here is like, I desperately need to know the answer. But I always try to remember, I have some answers that I say over and over and over and over again. And I say them because people tell me that it meant something to them. Mm-hmm. And I realize for a lot of people, I might have said it a lot, but they haven't heard it. And one of the things I say a lot is that you can love somebody and still say goodbye to them. Mm-hmm. And you can miss them every day, and it doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. Yeah. So the number of times I've said that, I should deliver it better. But but it's something, I've probably said that, thousands and thousands of times I've said that. But I find for the people who need to hear it, it really lands with them. And so I really am thinking more of what's my best answer that might be useful for someone? And I try not to focus as much on how tired I am, but you're a human being, and every once in a while I'm like, I've said this just
so many times.
Too many times. Yeah. But I guess I think a lot of what it would have meant for me to hear that when I was trying to make some difficult decisions about my own father, and feeling like I didn't really have permission to make those decisions. Like I have to just be a good daughter, I have to be a good person, and I think I felt for a long time like I couldn't have the kind of boundaries that later I would have. Mm-hmm. But I think I imagine it's almost like I do all my events and I'm talking to myself, but like a younger version.
Yes.
And I find that motivating.
Yes.
So I'm mentally disturbed, and it helps me a lot. Mm-hmm. I hallucinate. Don't worry, everything's fine.
Yeah.
But it does help me a lot.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did you have a poem that you wanted to read for us?
Sure. I can just recite one.
You can.
Yes.
I give you my permission.
Okay.
Not that you need it.
Home. Have I forgotten it? Wild conch shell dialect, black apostrophe curled tight on my tongue, or how the Spanish built walls of broken glass to keep me out, but the doctor bird kept chasing and raking me in. This place is your place, wreathed in red sargassum, ancient driftwood nursed on the pensive sea, the ramshackle altar I visited often, packed full with fish skull, bright with lignum vitae plumes. Father, I have asked so many miracles of it, to be patient and forgiving, to be remade for you in some small wonder. And what a joy to still believe in anything. My diction now as straight as my hair, that stranger we've long stopped searching for. But if somehow our half-sunken hearts could answer, I would cup my mouth in warm bowls over the earth and kiss the wet dirt of home. Taste bog mud and one long orange peel for skin. I'd open my ear for sugar cane and long stalks of gungo peas to climb in. I'd swim the sea, still lapsing in its sodded frame. The sea that again and again calls out my name. If y'all could have seen my mom, she was mouthing every line. I cannot.
You have a lot of writing and imagery in the book about the ocean.
Yes.
And I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Yes, I mean, the sea was the first home I knew. I was born by the small fishing village in Montego Bay, where my mother's family was from, her father, grandfather, great-grandfather. And so for me, this was where my childhood began and where my dreams were nurtured and nourished. And so whenever I think about my writing or think about my poetry or get homesick, I think about the sea that made me. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I have one more question. This week I reread your book, which I read the first time over the summer. Mm-hmm. And in the back of the book, I found a sentence that I'd written with no context and no explanation whatsoever. And now I'm going to make you respond to it.
Okay.
I have no idea what I was thinking when I wrote this, but what I wrote was, we don't leave who we were behind. We rescue them.
I love that. That's my answer. I love that. I agree.
That was my takeaway from your book, so maybe you can tell me what it means.
I mean, I love No, I really love what you said earlier about how when you answer the questions about your book and think about your life, that you're really talking to your younger self. And that's kind of how I think about this book as well, that it was written to her, to my younger self, to that 16-year-old girl who felt like she didn't have a voice, she didn't belong, for some time felt like her life had no value, that what she had to say had no meaning. And this book is written to her. This book is in tribute to her. If you get the book, you'll see the end papers of this book is a poem, the first poem I published when I was 16 years old, called Silver. And the cover of the book is an imprint of the hibiscus I used to draw in my darkest moments. And so even down to the design of the book, it was made for her, that if somehow I could hand this book into her hands, that she would know everything would be okay. And she should continue writing her poems and dreaming and continuing on the path that she's on. And that she, in fact, will rescue herself.
Safiya Sinclair, ladies and gentlemen. We have a couple minutes for questions. I've preserved exactly 17 minutes for questions. Someone probably told me how this is going to work, and I forgot.
Okay.
Oh, they're passing around a microphone, so if you have a question, raise your hand. We have one here, we have one here, we have one in the back.
Yes, Mary.
Wait, this is my job. You can't
Sorry.
usurp my job.
Hi. So I have two questions, and you can just choose which one you find more interesting to answer.
Multiple choice, I like it.
Oh. You can choose which one you find more interesting to answer. So you have memorized the entirety of Sylvia Plath's poem, Daddy.
Yes.
And when I've heard you recite it, it seems like a very cathartic way of dealing with generational and familial trauma. My first question is, do you have advice for those of us who have lived through religious trauma the way you have? And the other question I have is, how do you imagine your work to fit into kind of the reconciliation of different branches of the Black diaspora, Black Americans, West Africans, Black Europeans? If you do, how you fit into that?
Answer both.
Mary, I thought you were going to ask me easy questions this way.
The audience questions are always harder.
Religious trauma. I don't know if I have advice for that, because I don't know if I have fully worked through my own trauma. And I don't even know if I would call it religious trauma. I guess it is. It's like patriarchal trauma from extremist views of religion. My advice is don't write a memoir about it. I don't know how to answer that one. Therapy. Therapy is good. The diaspora. I feel like when I wrote the book, was not thinking about where in the diaspora the book was situated, but I do know that I was inspired by many writers in the Black diaspora throughout the course of my life and in the writing of the book. Jamaican folklorist poet Louise Miss Lou Bennett is a big influence in this book, and the way that she incorporates our vernacular and our patois in her poetry. That was something that I thought about when I was writing the book and the dialogue in the book. Similarly, Toni Morrison is somebody who is, for me, like the goat, the goddess. And when I was writing the book, I read a lot of novels. I read a lot of Toni Morrison's novels, thinking about and just sort of marveling at her narrative structures when I was thinking about writing prose for the first time. And Audre Lorde also was somebody that I thought about in writing the book. And in her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, she has this really great quote that I always come back to. I teach this essay every year in every class, where she says, poetry can be the bridge across our fears to a future that we'd never imagined before. And I thought about that a lot when I was writing this book, because I wanted something about the book, if it did anything at all in the world, was that it could be written toward a place of hope, that the book itself could facilitate some kind of change, even a small one within my family, or otherwise. But I was thinking about my niece, and I was thinking about the future generation of Sinclair girls to come, that in writing this book, that they wouldn't only know the past and the traumas of our family, but that the book itself would be this kind of currency for changing the future that is ahead of them, so that whoever comes next will know herself.
We have another one here.
Having read Tara Westover's book and not having read yours, I wondered if you could compare and contrast. It seemed to me two themes in hers were the amount of violence she encountered growing up, and the other was how important education is. And it seemed to me you were having an education with other non-Rasta students, and I wondered how important that was in building up the moment where you feel like I can't lead this Rasta life, I need to break away. Was your education important, and was there a certain amount of violence in your upbringing that was an important influence?
I wouldn't say the violence was an important influence. It was an unfortunate sort of occurrence. And that in Jamaica we're kind of born out of this sort of post-colonial violence, imperialist violence, and a lot of Jamaicans deal with that with their violence. I was an unfortunate child of that, but I don't think it was an influence. But certainly education and literature was, everything to me. It made a world that could have been incredibly small, very expansive. And it made the future, when I thought about the possibilities for myself, seem endless, even though, if in reality it wasn't. And so literature really gave that to me. And my mother always fostered our love of education. I mean, she had her own curriculum of teaching me and my siblings after school and on the weekends that she developed herself. And so it was always ingrained in me and was a large part of my childhood and upbringing.
I just have one follow-up. What was the book of poetry she gave you?
It was called Poems from a Child's World.
That's a beautiful title.
Thank you.
I think we had a question in the very back.
I was wondering, what did you learn about yourself through writing the memoir? And what pointers could you give about getting through the challenging or triggering parts, trauma or what have you? How did you get through it?
Get through the writing specifically?
Yes.
Yeah.
What did I learn about myself? So when I began this book, when I began thinking about this book about 10 years ago, I wouldn't say, well, I was never a forgiving person. I would never categorize myself as a forgiving person.
Good to know.
Yes. Punishingly so. But then something surprising happened in the writing of the book, and actually pretty late in the writing of the book, that I began to think about how I was portraying my father, and for all of his complexities and his harshness and the way that he wielded, violence and so on. But I had to talk to him the way I wanted to write about how he came to Rastafari. And I wanted to talk to him about his adolescence. And in talking to him, for the first time, feeling that he was humanized in this way, telling me these stories about his life and his childhood and his traumas, and how I had to express that on the page, I began to feel this, that I wanted to express this sense of nuance about him as a person on the page. And in the act of writing it, felt that I was slowly becoming a forgiving person. And, by the time I got to the end, I felt that, okay, it was through this idea of hopeful, a hope that there is a change between me and my father. Through this forgiveness or whatever else comes next. It's still a rocky road, but the book itself taught me that it can be a currency for healing. And that was surprising. Your second question, how did I get through it? Like I said, I began thinking about this like a decade ago. When I first moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, and I had left home in this really traumatic way, and I began thinking about the book, but I still had all these wounds and I had all this hurt. And I had a professor there, his name is Gregory Orr, and he said to me, I think you need to write this from a place of safety. And I don't think you have that yet. And he was right. I did not have that place of safety. And I needed that distance, and I needed that sort of emotional tranquility to actually dive into those memories. So that's how I dealt with it, simply just distance from the thing and from those memories. Yeah.
We have one more here.
Yeah, how you doing? Just after you wrote the book and you went into the copy editing, the whole editing experience, how did you find that?
I see my agent laughing because she knew I dragged them through the ringer. Sorry, continue.
Well, how did you feel about the, the process of being edited and making all the changes and the suggestions? How do you take it?
There are people here who know the answer to that
They
question.
do. I know it very well, very well. I will say this, as a poet, my process goes, I write the poem, I hand the poem, and they say, thank you for this poem, right? That's what I was used to, right? And I got back a letter that was saying like, like say it was 10 pages and 8 of the pages were like, it's great, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, but those last 2 were like, perhaps you could change this chapter around, or you could say more about this. And I was like, what is this? What is this? You mean you're not just receiving it and saying thank you? This is the best thing I've ever read. So, in the process of editing, it was also a process of humility and opening myself to collaboration on the page. Usually I never incorporate anybody else's opinions on the page. And then I received the letters and I went away for long months at a time, said nothing. Brooding, stewing. And then finally I returned to the pages and, that's actually a good point. Okay. All right, okay, maybe, that's, and then I was like, oh, this is why people have editors and stuff. Like, the objectivity that they have and their suggestions actually make it better. Wow. So, this was like a learning process for me, being edited, but ultimately a really rewarding one and a really amazing one. And, this book wouldn't be what it is today without my editor. And my editor, Don Davis, clap for yourself.
We have time for one more. We got one in that back corner I saw.
Nicole.
Hi. You recited your poetry from memory, which was so beautiful. And I'm really interested in the idea of how trauma can affect memory, and find the idea of recitation or chanting as a way to grapple with trauma or memory. So I was curious if you could talk about the experience of writing this memoir versus the experience of writing poetry. And do you feel closer to your memories of trauma or your past through poetry, or more so when you're recounting the experiences?
I wouldn't say I feel closer or not closer through either. I think that each form has given me something different in the way that I think about memory. And I think more about memory than I think about trauma. And maybe they're not even necessarily different, that they're kind of interwoven in some kind of way. For poetry, I always find that memory is kind of the window or the wellspring that I dive into for the poem to bloom. And I go there a lot with the lines and what you can do with lyric and the uncertainty of lyric, and the way that a memory can give you access to something, an image, but then you can transform it and turn it into something else and something else and something else. And I love that poetry can do that. And with prose, with my poems, a lot of the time I have like the title, I have the first line, I have an image, but I never necessarily know where the poem is going to go or what the poem is going to teach me until I actually get there and I write it. And it turns out you can't write a 350-page book of prose that way, that you actually have to like know where you're going and outline it. Yes, Dawn. And so I had to access my memories not as this kind of window of jumping away or imagery on uncertainty, but it had to be grounded in fact. It had to be grounded in some kind of truth. And a lot of the time, I also talked to my siblings and tried to access their memories or have them share their memories with me to see, if I remembered it correctly or how did they remember it, and tried to incorporate and interweave their own memories as well in the book. And so that to me was an interesting difference in writing the different genres. Yeah.
All right, I think that is the end. Sorry? I think you're coming on. Come on. She's coming on.
Thank
Thanks
you
everybody
all
for coming.
Yes, thank you guys for bringing this conversation. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So, Safiya was so generous and signed all these wonderful books. So everybody does have a signed copy, but if you want to get your book personalized, we'll be forming a line down here, and then we'll just get you settled and then invite people so they can have a moment of conversation. Thank you two again so much for this fabulous conversation on this stage.
Thank you all for coming.
And thank you all for coming. Have a good night.